Our final speaker for Widening 2024's first virtual session reports for an innovative media platform that was founded in 2018, and it asks this provocative question: how can science look more like us? Shreya Agrawal is a climate journalist and communicator who reports on the environment, health, politics, and social issues. She's the newsroom fellow for the Xylom, an award-winning online science publication. Shreya is also the engagement coordinator for the USC Annenberg Center of Climate Journalism and Communication. And she is a news reporting cohort fellow for Sojourner magazine, among many other roles. Her work has been published in several outlets, including the LA Times, Cal Matters, and she's been interviewed on the LAist, KCBS, and KQED radio stations to talk about her reporting. You can read Shreya's full bio on our website at nationalpress.org. But Shreya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me here.
So I know you've prepared a great presentation for us, and so I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
So thank you everybody for being here. Just wanted to quickly chat about my work, my background, a little bit about investigative reporting, what I've learned, during my short career, and we'll open it up to questions at the end, and see what you guys have to say. So I'll just give you a quick trip down my memory lane. I was born in India near the Himalayas, but I also spent a bunch of my time in the Bay Area growing up. So I feel like I grew up in both countries, in India and the United States, which has really helped me a lot with just my reporting, just like being someone from two different places, has, I guess, made me more empathetic to people's lived experiences and, just what people have gone through. Well, why I decided to become a climate communicator, I had my first existential crisis about climate change when I was 5 years old. I was reading an encyclopedia about, sea level rising and the sun's going to swallow up the earth in like 2 billion years. And my little brain could not understand what 2 billion years meant. Like I would die by then, but I don't understand. And I was like, what's going to happen to my parents if all of that happens? And so that kind of started my journey into environmentalism. I got into USC, studied geology and English at first. And then I was like, how do I connect these two? Ended up going to journalism school, and then everything made sense because I realized I wanted to be a climate journalist. I wanted to talk about climate change. I wanted to communicate climate change and, all of the different intersections that it has with, with race, with social issues, with politics. So I had that aha moment in 2022, and I founded my own climate reporting desk at USC called Annenberg Media Earth. And that's kind of been the start of my journey into journalism. So what did we really do at the Xylom, which like I report at the Xylom. I'm actually their first newsroom fellow. We, as we hear about newsrooms firing people, the Xylom's kind of taking the opposite direction to be like, no, we need to hire more people. We need to hire like staff members. We need to give people job security. And so I got very lucky to be picked as like the first newsroom fellow. And basically what we do is, we support student voices. And as you can read, the communities influencing and shaped by science. But what does that really mean? And I think it means a lot of different things at the Xylom, and we try to take an innovative approach to it. If you look at our website, most of our stories are written by people of color, and they report on people of color. And we just don't report on stories in the United States. We usually report on stories in Nigeria, India, all of these different countries around the world, because we know that, not only the climate crisis, but so many of our issues, they are rooted in global, like, they are connected in a global sense. Like, even though the newsroom is based here in the United States, a lot of people, I mean, the United States is made of immigrants, right? So a lot of people bring in their culture, they bring in their experiences from all around the world. And so we need to report on international stories. And we need to include all of these different perspectives that have not been featured in the media for such a long time. And so we also try to bring in hard to talk about topics like endometriosis is something that we've done a lot of reporting on. Greenwashing is something we talk a lot about, especially in terms of, oil companies and all of these major corporations spreading messages saying, hey, we're doing the right thing. But when you take a look at it, they're actually just trying to like further their agenda. And it really puts people of color at risk. It really puts poor communities at risk. And so we try to report on those kind of stories. So when we say we want to report, when we say we focus on communities influenced by science and communities that participate in science, that's what we mean, because science is everywhere. I mean, all of these companies are using different parts of science to, make their products. And so we want to make sure that we are holding them accountable, that when they say things like, Shell, it has been saying they're trying to do better with, not putting as much methane in the air. But really, when you remove oil from the ground, you are emitting some amount of methane, right? So we try to hold them accountable. And we also focus on community building because that's the only way we can get forward, and deal with things like climate change, with racism, with all of these different issues that we were dealing with today. Only communities, when they come together, can, fix problems. And so I'll just show a couple of stories that we've done before. Like this was a story on menstruation from someone in India. She wrote an article for us, basically talking about how, in Indian society, menstruation is considered something like, disgusting. Usually words like disgust show up, or it's considered unholy, it's considered dirty. And so a lot of women are pressured to play with their cycles, stop their menstruation just because people don't want to hear about it, or people think it's something that's impure. But it's such, I mean, for women and for AFAB folks, I mean, that's like an integral part of your body. I mean, it's a natural part of your body. And so we try to center all of these different perspectives in when we're trying to recruit writers, when we're trying to get more stories. And, a lot of newsrooms talk about DEI and they don't always meet the DEI perspectives. But, I mean, I'm a woman of color. Alex, my editor, he is from Hong Kong. So we, like all of the staff, I guess, at the Xylom, we are, people of color, and we truly believe in bringing in more perspectives and lifting people up. Like, we got these opportunities. I got my opportunity because of Alex. Alex got his opportunities because of other people. And now we want to make sure that we can get more people like us heard. There's another story that we did on gas flaring in the Niger Delta. And again, even the story was done by someone who didn't have much experience in journalism. But just because someone didn't go to journalism school, doesn't have too much experience in journalism, doesn't mean that they can't be a writer, that they can do journalism. And so at the Xylom, we really try to bring in writers from all different kinds of perspectives, all kinds of skill backgrounds, because we really believe that, even if you aren't trained in journalism, you can tell a good story. I mean, I personally really feel very strongly about people, from not the journalism field coming in and telling their stories. Just because my personal background, I wanted to be a scientist before I decided to be a journalist. And it's only because people in journalism pushed me. They were like, you can do it. You can learn how to be a journalist. That's why I am here. And so I really believe that if someone wants to tell a story, we can make sure you get to tell the story. So we at the Xylom, encourage writers from all different kinds of backgrounds to come and write for us. And our job is to basically train them in how to be a better journalist, how to be a better communicator, teach them the skills they need, and we make sure the stories get better by the end of it. So as Rachel mentioned, I also work for several other publications at the moment, including the USC Annenberg Center for Climate Journalism and Communication, where I basically train other journalists and students in how to be a better climate journalist and a better climate communicator. And Rachel mentioned I've previously written for all of these publications. So what do I really do with the Xylom? It kind of feels like everything, because I write stories for them, I edit for them, I fact check. There's all these different kinds of things. I've been working on a few investigative stories that I will mention later in my presentation, but I also do like a bunch of community reporting. I've been doing a bunch of editing and fact checking, like the previous two articles that I mentioned. Those are pieces that I have edited and fact checked. I'm also working on a podcast about redlining and environmental justice here in LA. And with my role at USC, I do a lot of like, planning journalism and comms events. We actually have Jane Fonda coming to USC to talk about her climate activism work, which is like super exciting. One of the highlights of Earth Month for us. And I work on a bunch of climate communication surveys and reports. One that I'm working on right now basically looks at what climate journalists and communicators feel like they're lacking, because oftentimes we just don't have enough resources to provide, especially to local journalists, on how they can report on climate change better. And again, I'm talking about climate because that's my beat, but at the same time, I feel that's true for so many journalism skills, right? I mean, local journalists just don't get as many resources, and they have to cover all the stories in their community. So how can we support them better? We just need to provide them more funding, but also provide them more training resources so they can cover investigative stories in their area, so they can cover things like climate, which might be a bit hard to cover just because there's so much jargon involved, just because you need so much background to get into it. And the last one, being a rainmaker, I recently heard this term. Someone told me it's a Native American term used for people who bring other people together, who connect other people together. And that's one of my favorite things to do. Making sure the people around me are connected. So like, anytime I talk to a journalist and I'm like, oh, you would be great friends with this other person who I know, I try to connect people together because I really believe in community building. And I really believe that's the only way we can get any work done that's meaningful. So why am I here? Mostly to tell you, you got this. Just because I don't think, people hear this often in journalism. You get into a story and sometimes it just feels like when you're starting from zero, it really feels like, what am I doing here? Do I even know what I'm talking about? And I want to tell you, you do. Or if you don't, you're going to learn it on the way and you'll make mistakes, you'll get there. You've got this. But let's talk about investigations for a second, just because that's the topic of today. And these are just, I'm going to give you some like tips, advice, just some stuff that I've learned along the way, as I've done like the few investigative stories that I've worked on. So one thing that I think you should know, investigations, although it sounds like such a big word, it sounds so complex and you're like, oh my God, that's something that only like real journalists do. But honestly, they're not that different from any other kind of reporting, except you just get a lot of time to work on those stories. And that's what turns a story into an investigation, when you're spending a lot of your time on it, when you're just, given a lot of resources to make sure you can go as deep as possible into those stories. And usually there's an accountability and harm aspect associated with investigations. But really, when you really dig into something, you can always find that accountability angle. And so, all the stories that you've done in the past, those could turn into investigative stories if you had the amount of time. So there's nothing special about investigative reporting in that sense. Like, it's not an entirely new class of journalism, it's just the same thing, except you get more time. So if you're thinking about where I can find investigative stories, you probably already have a few right under your nose, because these are usually stories that you've worked on before. things that you are passionate about. So something that I really care about personally is looking at, what oil companies have been doing, especially with all of their new regulations. And, they've been buying into a lot of renewables, or like trying to say, we are not releasing as much methane into the atmosphere as we were doing before. Like, we've been really careful with it. But if you just look at the surface, that's what you can report on. But as you get to go deeper into it, you'll find that sometimes people are lying. And so you can think about the stories that you've done in the past. How can you expand on them? That's a really great way to make sure that, you can find investigative stories. Like, it doesn't feel like, oh, this is so unapproachable. No, it's something that you can totally do with the stories that you've done before, with the topics that you've dealt in the past. There's always an investigative story happening. So just look at what's happening in your beat. Who's getting harmed? Who needs to be held accountable? Those are really good questions to ask. Because when you start looking into them and you like develop your sources, you look at documents, stuff like that, you can usually find something that no one else has reported on, and something that you feel is like, oh, that's an enterprise story. That's like breaking news. I need to, report on this. No one's heard about this. So usually you can like also find stories by building good relationships with your sources. Like, sometimes I will just, I've become kind of friends with a few of my sources. Like, we get on calls like every now and then, and they'll like just, send me a photo being like, oh, this place is saying they recycled synthetic turf, but that's not actually happening. So they'll send me a photo and I'm like, that's an incredible angle to a new story. So just, I guess, build good relationships with your sources beyond the daily grind, by which I mean, again, your sources are people. I mean, at the end of the day, they're people. Like, they just want to be heard. They just want to tell their own stories. So I try not to treat them as sources all the time. I mean, yes, when you're on a story, you need to, keep boundaries, but you can still continue to have relationships with them after you're done with the story. And that's how some of my best stories have come. Just, by like talking to my sources a few months after the story was done, and they were like, hey, have you heard about this? And I was like, whoa, that's exciting. So that's like a tip that has worked for me in the past. So how can you get started? And I know all of you probably have really busy schedules, and you're like, how do I get into an investigative story when I'm saddled with so many other stories? I have so many other commitments. Like, what do I do to actually produce an investigative story? And honestly, it is possible. It will just take some amount of time and probably some amount of commitment on your part to make sure you can achieve it, but it's totally possible. And as I mentioned, it's really easy to do when you can find investigative stories on your own beat, because that means that you can continue to pursue all these other stories and still make sure you can get your investigative story done. So again, as I said, cultivate your sources, but also become an authority on your beat. Like, know what's happening in and around your beat, because that will really help you understand your own story better and maybe dig deeper into a story that normally you won't have enough time for. Think about what are the big questions on my beat. What are the questions that people haven't answered? What isn't happening? And if you can do a big project, because sometimes editors don't want to give you all that time to do a certain project, investigative stories just require so much time, right? If you can do that, then just do incremental stories. You can do like short pieces and build up to it. So you guys have probably heard of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein working on the Watergate stories. They never produced a huge investigative story on the Watergate scandal. What happened was a series of incremental stories over time that they built upon, and that turned into a huge investigative project by the end of it, but they didn't know what they were doing. And so that's totally an option if your editor feels more comfortable with giving you like, a small chance, like, okay, maybe do like 1,000-word story, maybe do a 1,500-word story and not an investigative story. Take that, get started. I think that's the best way to like, see if your story even has viability to become an investigative story. And really try to find data and documents, because really data and documents, they are your best friends, especially when it comes to an investigative story. because sometimes you can even find stories hidden in the fine print, like even data that's saying one thing, if you really look close into it, you might find it's saying another thing. And data can really help you make your story stronger, because especially with investigative stories, you really have to be careful about making sure that the harm you're talking about is really happening. So really, data and your documents, they are your best friends. And so I have some more tips and helpful resources just to get you started. What's helped me in the past is talking to other investigative reporters and just learning from their process. One of my professors at USC, he always told me, so he went to India for a story this one time, and he was like, I just bought them pizza and beer just to make them talk to me, because those workers just did not want to talk to me until I did that. And I'm not saying you have to do the same thing, but it's really helpful to know what people have done in the past to make sure they get their sources, to make sure they get their stories. It just helps you on your journey. Like, let's say if you're stuck, you can be like, oh, I know this guy who did that. Let me try that, you know? So if you know other reporters that you admire or investigative journalists, just set up coffee chats with them, just get to know them, learn from their process, ask questions. I mean, we are journalists, just ask as many questions as you can, learn from other people. I recently attended the Ida B. Wells Society boot camp on investigative reporting. It was a 2-day boot camp, and a bunch of speakers came from like ProPublica, AP, Washington Post, all of these different organizations, and they talked about their process, which I actually borrowed some of what they taught me to put into this presentation here. So definitely check that out. I think it's a great resource, and the Ida B. Wells Society is really supportive of journalists of color, especially when it comes to investigations, because as you know, we don't see many people of color in investigative newsrooms, and I really believe we need to change that. And I think try to get as many resources as possible, just to make sure you get there. And as I said in my next point, if IRE and NICAR seem too intimidating, go to other society conferences where you feel seen. Just because those are not the only places where you can find investigative reporters, even though those are traditionally the investigative conferences. I've heard so many great, panels, and I've been to so many other great talks and stuff at conferences like SEJ, where they've talked about their investigative processes for environmental stories. And so I don't think IRE and NICAR should be your only source for investigations, or getting tips about investigative journalism. You should go to all of these other society conferences, where you meet people who look like you, because sometimes that's important. When you walk into a room and no one looks like you, when your culture or your background isn't appreciated, sometimes that can feel like a letdown. And I've definitely felt that at times, but it really shouldn't have to feel like that. And I really hope things change in the future. But another thing that you should do is read investigative stories and try to break them down. Like, understand the process, understand how they report on these stories. Like, what was their start, what was their finish, how did they get from like how did they get from point A to point B to point C, and how did they report them? Because that will really help you understand what you need for your own investigative stories in the future. And the most important tip that I wanted to give all of you, please redefine what investigative journalism means for you. And by this, I mean is when sometimes you hear about someone else's investigative process and it doesn't feel like something you would do, that doesn't mean you can't make it as an investigative journalist. It just means that your process into investigative journalism is probably just going to be different. And that doesn't make you any less of an investigative journalist. Because for every person, journalism looks different. Some people like asking a lot of questions, and there are other people who are just happy to sit back and let the sources talk to them, be involved in the whole thing without asking questions. I met this journalist at a conference last year. Her name is Valerie Van de Pan, and she is a Native American journalist, and reports on different indigenous communities. And what she told me was she doesn't ask them any questions at all. She just sits back and lets them talk. she says, I don't want to be disrespectful. Sometimes they'll tell me stuff, and then maybe I'll ask a few follow-up questions. But that's her process. Even when she does investigations, that's her process. She doesn't ask a lot of questions. But then there are other people who ask a lot of questions, and that's what works for them. So I think you need to figure out what works best for you. And the only way you're going to do it is through trial and error. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. Just take as many risks as you can. And just try what works for you. Try different kinds of processes. Go to these different investigative reporters, set up coffee chats, talk to them, maybe try a few things out that they tell you. And if it doesn't work for you, then you know that it doesn't work for you. Try something else. But really, if someone makes you feel like you can't be an investigative reporter, which I've personally heard in the past too, I've had a few professors who were like, oh, you can't really be an investigative journalist if you're not like brave enough to go out there and try. And there are some things that don't work for me, but that's fine. I am not the journalist that they are. Their process is different. Doesn't mean that I'm not any good, So you just need to believe in yourself and just go forward and trust your process. So some of the investigative stories that I'm working on for the Xylom, one is on the impact of lithium mining in Imperial Valley. So I don't know if you guys have heard, but the Biden administration has contracted this huge area to build a lithium mine in Imperial Valley just because there's a huge deposit, but that means a lot of communities get displaced. And what really happens after the mine runs out is my question, because until the mine's there, yes, there's economic prosperity in the area, but as happened with Appalachia in in the 60s and 70s, when the mines started running out, when the iron business started collapsing, the community started to collapse, and there was no economic growth in these areas. And I feared that something similar is going to happen with Imperial Valley. And so that's something that I'm looking into. I'm also looking into fire insurance in California and Oregon because insurance companies have started to pull out, which means a lot of people are either going uninsured or have to pay extremely huge premiums just to make sure that they can stay safe. And the last story that I'm working on is recycling of synthetic turf. So if you've ever heard of synthetic turf, it's like artificial grass. And a lot of companies say it's eco-friendly because you don't have to water it, but it can also be recycled. But again, it can be recycled, but we know better. There's like one company that says it recycles synthetic turf, but actually it sends all the synthetic turf from California to Texas, and then it burns it there because Texas laws are different around what can be termed as recycling. California doesn't accept incineration as recycling, Texas does. So anyway, we are trying to uncover that story. A few other stories that I'm working on. I'm doing a podcast on redlining and environmental justice in LA. And then there's this community story that I'm looking at, which is about eco-chaplaincy and how, we can use religion to help fight climate anxiety. That's something I'm very passionate about. And I'm working on several other climate communication projects at the same time. So as I said, journalism is hard, but you're here for a reason, so trust your gut. It's hard, but you can make it. I mean, I'm pretty sure all of you have your own origin stories with how you got into journalism, why you wanted to be a writer, and trust those stories, even if they don't sound like the stories you've heard from me or from other people. I think all of those stories are valid because everyone has a different career path. And, it's not that if your path's different from somebody else's that you can't make it. You're going to make it. All of you in this room are going to make it. So like really trust your own process. And one thing that I've learned over time, people love giving advice. Like I'm doing that with you guys today, giving you so much advice. You can listen to all of it, but you don't have to follow all of it just because, everyone's process is different. So experiment, try, do what feels best for you. And really just trust your gut. So now's the time for any questions. If you guys have any, please feel free to jump in.
I have to say, just thinking about little 5-year-old Shreya, literally becoming a climate journalist in that moment when you worried about what the future held was a very powerful image. I want to ask you a question, Shreya, before I open it up to the journalists. I wanted to ask you is, um, we are living in a time when there's so much pushback to inclusion and equity, and so much of investigative journalism writ large is about who's getting what and who's not getting what, and who's getting access to resources, et cetera, et cetera. So, in your reporting, how much of that are you encountering, and how do you deal with it when you do?
Um, it depends on the newsroom that I'm a part of generally. Like the Xylom, we are a small newsroom and we really don't have as many resources as like some of the other newsrooms that I worked at, like LA Times and Cal Matters. There, I had access to so much more than I have access to here at the Xylom. And so I spend a lot of my time applying to grants just to make sure I can cover the stories that I want to. Um, and that really, I mean, hurts me in a sense that, I could be spending all my time reporting on the story instead of applying for grants to report on the story. And I mean, I'm not saying that I have it bad. Like it's not bad. It's a great place to work, and I'm really happy that I'm getting all these experiences. But at the same time, I really feel like there needs to be some sort of like balance, especially for, these small nonprofit newsrooms or like local newsrooms. Local newsrooms suffer so much because of lack of resources. I mean, I worked at a newsroom in Oregon for a couple of months during last summer, and basically we were covering like 3 or 4 stories a week, which meant we had no time to do bigger stories like investigative stories. And that's pretty much because local newsrooms don't have enough money to pay their reporters. And so, you can only hire so much people and they have to cover everything in the area, which means we have no resources for investigative stories. But at the other hand, sometimes, these stories also just never see the light of day just because there's so many other priorities that you have. Even like when I was in Oregon, I heard about so many investigative stories that I could have done and that I wanted to do, but it's just there's so many other pressing stories that you need to cover that it just like never gets done. And I don't have an answer to how to make it better. I just want local newsrooms to just get more resources over time. I really hope the Press Forward initiative that was launched by the American Journalism Project, I mean, I really hope that happens, and I really hope they give money to more BIPOC newsrooms and local newsrooms.
Let's take a question from Caroline. Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, yes. Hi, my name is Caroline Colvin. I'm a DEI reporter for HR Dive. Heard you definitely on the idea of like pushback, Rachel, especially with like DEI. But my question is about climate reporting. So I actually recently started a Substack about climate justice and like sustainability. And I think something that I'm wrestling with is how do you get like buy-in from readers who aren't necessarily interested in climate justice specifically, like people in the EJ field. And I think something that I've been thinking about a lot is you mentioned like eco anxiety, and I feel like there's like two camps of people, right? People who are like constantly like doling out stats that show like the dire state of our earth and how everything is going to be bad soon. But then there's also people who are like on the climate optimism side of things. So I think I'm just kind of wrestling with like how, I don't know if I'm asking what's the best approach, but what do you feel like is the most effective approach when it comes to like climate reporting?
I try to, okay, I do have so many thoughts about that because that's the question that I ask myself all the time because you don't want to be too optimistic, but you also don't want to be too pessimistic. Um, I think there exists something in the middle that I like to call informed optimism. And so again, it's more about like not, or I guess realistic optimism, which suggests that you don't have to go towards the end of greenwashing. Like, do not support greenwashing. Do not be like, oh, the world is going to become a better place just because all of these companies say so. But at the same time, you can, promote communities and like I love telling stories about communities that are making a difference because I really feel that's one of the best ways to be optimistic. But at the same time, you are taking a more realistic sense that, okay, these communities are limited. It's just, you know, you have to spread that message of hope just so that you don't push people into the cycle of doom and gloom. But at the same time, tell them what's happening. Like, hey, this is a crisis. I mean, don't be too optimistic. We still need to fight it. And just remind them that there are so many people who are fighting it. And so you just have to be one of them. I guess that's what I try to do, but I don't think there's like a best approach to it, just because at the end of the day, I think for every reader, they feel differently about every story, right? So you just have to do what feels best for you. And for me, I just like to give people the information that I think they need, but at the same time remind them that, hey, there's still hope. People are doing something about the crisis. You asked one more question. I totally forgot what that was.
Oh, I feel like you answered my question really well, just about like striking the right balance. I think I also asked a little bit about getting buy-in from people who aren't just in the environmental justice space.
Right. Yeah, I've struggled a lot with that. I started a newsletter on climate change when I was back in grad school. And basically what I did was I tried to merge in all of their other interests into climate journalism. So like, you know, one great example that my boss at USC always gives is how can we connect climate change to things like skiing or outdoor sports? Because that's something that's like really you know, if you tell people that, hey, you can't ski anymore, alarm bells are going to rise, right? So, you know, you just have to like connect all of these different climate change topics to things that people actually care about. Like people care about job security. How is climate change going to impact their job security? You can talk about pocketbook issues. Like people care about their electricity bills, right? They care about their energy bills, their water bills. So you can bring in climate change through those angles and be, you know, I guess market your newsletter or your Substack in a way. And I would love to know what your Substack's called, by the way. Love to subscribe. But you can market it in a way that basically tells people that, hey, if you're worried about these different issues, then this is the perfect newsletter to subscribe to, because I will be talking about all of them and how climate change affects them. And that's just one idea. I mean, like you should go for what you feel is right.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Let's go to Julian now.
Hey Shreya, I'm Julian Sarapu. I'm a fellow at the Boston Globe. I wanted to ask you a little bit about like the international reporting that y'all do. Like, how do y'all find people in those places to do those stories? For one, you know, how do you stay connected? What's that kind of like logistically? And also with a lot of people who might not have done journalism before, how do y'all go about, you know, training them up quickly and also like supporting them in their journey of like figuring out how to do it?
Right, of course. So a lot of international folks, they just show up, like they just like pitch stories to us. We don't really go about finding them anymore because I think the Xylom's kind of made a reputation for being a safe haven for international journalists to report for, you know? So at this point, journalists just come to us and we try to take as many stories as we can, just because we want to make sure we give them a voice. Because I mean, I know how hard it is to pitch stories to different places. Personally, I've written so many pitches and nothing ever comes out of it, right? And sometimes for new writers, it can be really tough to write a convincing pitch that makes, you know, actually get somewhere. And so we try to take as many pitches as we can from new journalists, just because we want to make sure, you know, they get a space to start writing stuff. Logistically, it can be really difficult, especially when working with international journalists, just because of time zones. It can be kind of tough. So some of these stories end up having a longer time than we actually wanted to give them. Like, you know, the turnover time can be much, much longer than we would actually like, but that's okay. As long as we get the work published, I feel like we've accomplished what we wanted to. In terms of training, I just sometimes, you know, like to, you know, let the writers ask me questions about what works best, or, you know, ask them questions about what works best for them. During the editing process is usually when a lot of learning happens. I'm the kind of editor that likes to rewrite the piece entirely. And so I'll like, you know, leave comments on their original version, but then I also like go back and rewrite it. And I'm like, you know, you can just take whatever you want to, you can reject whatever you don't want in there. And I feel like that works really well for a bunch of writers, but I also try to be sympathetic to, you know, what the writer wants, how the writer wants to be edited, because I know that doesn't make everyone happy the first time when you like see someone rewriting your entire piece. Sometimes that's not really encouraging. But that's how I've learned from my editors, when like they would rewrite the entire top of my story, and then I was like, wow, this is so much better than what I had before. But I really feel for every single person it works differently, right? So I just try to give them as many resources as I can. I try to help them report when I can. I try to help with like fact checking or like finding more data, just like literally whatever they need.
Maher.
Oh, I think that you answered my question. I was just going to ask you about freelance pitches, and whether there are any pitches that you guys have ever turned down. And I was also curious, the international story that you showed us earlier, whether that was a freelance pitch.
That was a freelance pitch, and we do turn down a lot of stories just because, I mean, we can't actually take all of the stories, right? We do operate on a pretty small budget, and Alex and I are the only editors in the room, so it can get pretty hard, you know, just managing a lot of stories. But we really try very hard to give voice to new journalists, as much as we can. Sometimes we take pitches, obviously, because we think certain pitches are better than others, but really, as much as we can, we do try to give voice to new journalists.
Y'all should know that one of the covering rare diseases fellows for NPF for 2023 wrote her project for the Xylom. It is Crystal Chow from Hong Kong. And so that's how I learned about the publication, and that's how I came up with you. So funny the way those things work. I'm going to jump in, and if there are any other questions, please queue up so that we can know who has a question. But I want to do some real talk here, and I don't want you to take this as patronizing or anything other than the way it's intended. But when I started out, God, 40 years ago, and I would walk into the newsroom or into, let's say, the mayor's office of the small town in Florida where I was working. I would be immediately, if not greeted with, "What the heck are you doing here? Uh, I did not give you permission to speak to me." There was a lot of sort of barriers to me doing my job based on how I looked. And, 40 pounds ago, and 30 years ago, I looked young. And so there was a way that people sort of automatically didn't think that I was there to do business. Similarly, when I wound up at the National Public Radio, working at NPR in DC on the science desk, I was met with a sort of, "You're a science reporter? Uh, what do you know about this topic?" Or, calling experts and then having them come into the studio, and they'd spoken to me on the phone, but meeting me in person, it's like, "Oh, you're Black." So what I want to ask you about is, in this realm, how are you coming across those same kinds of interactions, or has things gotten better since I started out?
You know, things have gotten a bit better because I think people are more afraid to be called racist in today's times. And I'm not saying like people have become less racist over time. I think people are just more afraid that, you know, being a journalist, I think they realize how much power journalists have. And, you know, they know if I like, you know, call them racist, or if I say, you know, I met with this person and they did not treat me the way that they should have, with a lot of respect, they're going to call out for it. And so I feel in that way things have gotten better, but I still do experience at times, like when I lived in rural Oregon, there were a few times when I walked into a room trying to do a story, and, you know, I'm kind of like, I'm 5'3" and I'm skinny, so I look small too. And they just like sometimes talk to me in a patronizing tone, just because I look young and I sound young, and they're like, oh, she's just a young woman of color, like, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And so they talk to me in a patronizing way. Personally, I just try not to take it personally because I know it's nothing about me. It's about them. It's they, I mean, if they think I have no power, then they are the ones who are wrong. And I just try to like go ahead with as many questions. And one thing I realized, like being a journalist, it's fun because like you can pretend to be dumb even when you're not. Like sometimes, I just like want to get my story and get out of there. And I will just like let them talk to me the way they want to and get my story and get out of there. But I really do wish things were better. I mean, like I wish I didn't have to go through that. I wish people did treat me with more respect. Sometimes I will bring up the fact that I do have a science degree to, get the point across and being like, hey, I know you're talking to me in this way, but I do understand what you're talking about. Like the jargon is getting through, so you don't have to do that. But I mean, it really depends on the kind of person I'm talking to. Like some old white folks, sometimes I just like, I don't want to get into trouble. I don't want to make a scene. And so sometimes I just like let them talk to me in the way they want to. But yeah, I don't know if that's answering your question.
No,
but
in one sense, yes, I'm very pleased to hear you say that you feel that things are better. Certainly not as openly hostile as some of the things that I've experienced. But I guess the reason I ask is because of there's so much backlash now, and there's so much. And as you stated that people are afraid to be called racist, but I have my doubts even about that, given the what we're facing this year in the election cycle and the sort of overall mood in the country. But I'm going to start skewing towards the positive based on what you've said. I feel like young people who are prepared and empowered and kind of are pragmatic about it, they could probably deal with it a lot better than I did. I'm going to let Aditi jump in.
I just want to say one more thing to that. Oh, I'm so
Sure.
sorry. I'm
Go ahead,
just going
go
to
ahead.
add one more thing to that. I've learned that being firm with people and like standing your own ground really helps, like especially in situations that can become a bit worse than what I talked about. Because I do have like a few friends, like one of my friends, Maya Vinette, she's a reporter for USA Today, and she has been covering the elections recently, going to all of these different places in the South. And she is from the South, but she's Black. And so she understands, like she's, faced a lot of racism, just not only as a journalist, but as a Black woman growing up in the South. And the way she does it is she just like stands her ground when someone, doesn't treat her the way she deserves to be treated. She'll just she won't outwardly call them racist, but she's just going to be firm and like stand her ground. And she's someone that I learned a lot from personally, and how to deal with, these kind of sticky situations. But that just wanted to add that really helps sometimes.
Thanks. Aditi.
Hi, Shreya. Thank you for doing this. I am a writer for CNN. I wanted to ask you something that you mentioned earlier in your presentation. When you're accepting pitches or, reading through pitches for Xylom, do you take the same approach where you would rather work with a writer on like the brick by brick building a story instead of like a big investigation, like blowing a story wide open? Do you like how would you approach a new relationship with a new writer? Like, are you thinking, hey, let us get him or her to do this one small story first and then get a second version? Or are you like open to the full thing from the start?
That's the benefit of working with Xylom. If someone pitches us an investigative story and it sounds like a good pitch, we'll take it. Usually when we're working with a new writer, we are a bit more skeptical just because we don't know if they'll end up producing the stuff that they promise. But we don't pay people a lot. I mean, because we're a small newsroom, unfortunately. Like we would love to pay people more, but we can't. because we do operate on a limited budget. And so we just try to give people opportunities as much as they can. Usually when like people pitch a story to us and we accept it, we'll like sign the whole contract, and it's not a lot of money that we can offer even for a longer story. Like we usually offer people who've written for us before a bit more money, just because, you know, we know that they're going to turn in something that I mean, and it depends on like the length of the piece too, but like if you've written for us before and it's a longer piece, then we might be able to offer you more money just because you have credibility behind you. But again, if it's a new writer, we will still offer, like if it's a good story that they've pitched, we will still, you know, offer them a contract and everything. It just may come with less benefits. But again, we do try to take in as many stories as we can. And even if it's an investigative story by a new writer, we try to take it if it sounds like a good pitch. They might need more hand holding than other people. And, you know, that's like where we come in. We are willing to give them all the chances and give them as many resources as they need, because I mean, Alex and we both really believe in that message, just because I needed a lot of hand holding when I started my career. Alex got the same from other people, and so we really believe that we want to be, you know, a support system for new writers.
Are there any other questions? If not, I'm going to jump right in and wrap this up. I sort of have the feeling that the issue of climate change is ultimately almost the sort of generational centerpiece for so many different conversations. As you said, and as I started out by saying that, you know, thinking of you as that 5-year-old girl. But when we think of adults and parents in this moment right now who are bringing children into this world, into a world where 30 years from now, who knows what we're talking about. So again, to sort of get back to the earlier question about how do you frame this in ways that don't come across as, you know, panic and let's run into the streets. But when it comes to people of color and poor people and who are dealing with the biggest impacts of climate change, any advice on how to frame those stories in ways that help lessen the sort of otherness of this topic? That it's too bad if you live in the 9th Ward, or it's too bad if you live in Burundi or whatever. What advice do you have on helping us do that?
Talk about communities. Honestly, that's kind of been my approach to reporting on, you know, disadvantaged communities, just because even within those disadvantaged communities, there's always like a few community leaders who are trying to make things better for other people, and they don't operate alone. I mean, they have a whole army behind them usually. I mean, when they're starting out, sometimes they operate alone, but like, you know, everyone needs support to make sure things get better, like to make things better. The podcast series that I've been working on, one of the podcasts talks about basement flooding in New York, especially as a lot of immigrants live in these basement apartments. There's this one guy, Amit, he's been just like, you know, going out there, you know, lobbying for change and like trying to make sure people have a better life. But like at the same time, he's connected to all of these different organizations who are trying to help him get there. And so when you talk about disadvantaged communities in like different parts of the world, I mean, there are so many people who, you know, may not have heard of those places, but there are community leaders who want, like within those communities, who want to make things better. And usually you can kind of be, you know, the rainmaker for them, like connect them to other people, either through a story or just like, for me, I guess like journalism is not just about publishing stories. I think it's about like really trying to, you know, make people's lives better. And so even when I'm doing a story, sometimes like someone will tell me, oh, I'm going through all of this. And I'll just be like, hey, I've heard of this organization that like does this. Like, do you want me to connect you to them? And even though that's not part of my job, I will do that just because I mean, that's why I became a journalist, to help them, right? And even if I don't help them through the journalism, at least I can help them with like a connection or something. But I guess, yeah, I totally lost my train of thought. But I guess what I was trying to say is, I think it's really important to center those disadvantaged people in terms of communities, just so they realize they're not alone. And they aren't alone. It's just like, if people haven't heard about what's happening to them, they can feel alone. But that's where we come in and we make the difference.
Well, that's really what it boils down to. I think sometimes people are intimidated by the term science journalism or science reporters, or think you have to get into the weeds and get technical, but it really boils down to telling stories. And often these are stories that have been ignored and neglected. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I really think that science reporting doesn't have to be all about data and facts, because like the communities that do get shaped by science, they don't know about the data or the facts. They just know about their own personal experiences. And I think that's what's the most important when it comes to, telling these stories and like making sure these stories connect to other people and you share experiences. I mean, that's how, with my friends, like I don't talk about the data when it comes to climate change. I talk about how I'm feeling, or this like new thing I heard about that might make people's lives better. And so really I think about it as like making new friends through sharing stories,
What a terrific way to end this conversation and this whole day of conversations about investigative reporting, and what is the role, or what is the need for people who look like us to be involved in the process. So I want to take this opportunity, Shreya Agrawal of the Xylom and so many other organizations, to thank you so much for joining Widening the Pipeline.